You are a young cardinal in the Vatican, walking through the marble corridors of the Apostolic Palace on a humid summer night in 1503. The air is thick with incense and something else, something that makes your stomach clench with dread. As you approach the papal apartments, you hear sounds that should never echo through the holiest place on earth. Laughter, music, and moans of pleasure drift from behind ornate doors carved with images of saints and angels. You pause, your hand trembling as it reaches for the bronze handle, knowing that what you're about to witness will shatter every belief you hold about the sanctity of the Church. The door swings open to reveal a scene from Dante's deepest circle of hell. Pope Alexander VI, the supposed vicar of Christ on earth, reclines on silk cushions surrounded by naked courtesans and young men. Wine flows like water from golden chalices as bodies writhe together in acts that would make even the most depraved Roman emperor blush. But this isn't the worst part. In the corner, you see a young woman with familiar eyes, the same piercing gaze as the Pope himself. This is Lucrezia Borgia, his own daughter, and she's not here as an innocent observer. What you're witnessing isn't just papal corruption. It's the systematic transformation of the Vatican into a pleasure palace where the most sacred vows were broken nightly, where the Pope openly lived with multiple mistresses, and where his own children served as instruments of both political power and personal gratification. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, didn't just bend the rules of the Catholic Church. He shattered them completely, turning the seat of Christianity into his private brothel while maintaining the facade of holy leadership. This is the story of how one man's insatiable appetites nearly destroyed the Catholic Church from within, creating scandals so shocking that they're still whispered about in Vatican corridors 5 centuries later. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. To understand how Rodrigo Borgia became the most corrupt pope in history, we must first understand the world that created him. Renaissance Italy wasn't just a time of artistic flowering and intellectual advancement. It was also an era of unprecedented political chaos, where the Catholic Church had become less a spiritual institution than a temporal power competing with kings and emperors for control of European politics. The papal court of the late 15th century was a snake pit of ambition, intrigue, and corruption that made medieval royal courts look like monasteries by comparison. Cardinals purchased their positions with gold, priests openly kept mistresses, and the Pope himself was expected to be as much a military commander and political strategist as a spiritual leader. Born in 1431 near Valencia, Rodrigo was the nephew of Pope Calixtus III, a connection that opened doors throughout the church hierarchy. But it was his own combination of intelligence, charisma, and complete moral flexibility that allowed him to rise through the ranks with unprecedented speed. By age 25, he was already a cardinal. By 30, he was one of the most powerful men in Rome. And throughout this meteoric rise, one thing became increasingly clear. Rodrigo Borgia had no intention of letting religious vows interfere with his personal pleasures. The Catholic Church's requirement of clerical celibacy had always been more honored in the breach than in the observance. But most priests, and even high-ranking cardinals, at least attempted to maintain some pretense of chastity. Conducting their affairs with discretion, Rodrigo Borgia abandoned even this minimal hypocrisy. He openly acknowledged his mistresses, proudly claimed his numerous children, and used his ecclesiastical position to advance their secular careers. When Rodrigo finally achieved his ultimate goal of becoming pope in 1492, purchasing the papal crown through a combination of bribery and political maneuvering that shocked even Renaissance standards of corruption, he brought his entire extended family into the Vatican. The papal apartments became a household where his mistresses lived as queens, his children were treated as princes and princesses, and the distinction between the sacred and the profane disappeared entirely. The transformation of the Vatican under Alexander VI wasn't gradual. It was immediate and shocking. Within months of his election, the papal court had become legendary throughout Europe for its extravagance, debauchery, and complete abandonment of Christian principles. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in amazement and horror about what they witnessed during official visits. Even hardened Renaissance politicians were stunned by the open licentiousness that now characterized the center of the Catholic world. The transformation of Alexander VI from ambitious cardinal to depraved pontiff began almost immediately after his election. Within weeks of donning the papal tiara, Rodrigo Borgia began implementing changes that would have been unthinkable under any previous pope. His first act wasn't to address spiritual matters or church reform. Instead, he ordered the construction of luxurious apartments within the Vatican, specifically designed for entertaining his growing collection of mistresses. These weren't simple bedchambers. They were elaborate suites decorated with erotic frescoes, painted by some of Renaissance Italy's finest artists, who were paid enormous sums to create works that celebrated physical pleasure rather than spiritual devotion. The walls depicted scenes from pagan mythology, where gods and goddesses engaged in acts that would have made ancient Roman libertines envious. Visitors to these chambers reported seeing images so explicitly sexual that they seemed designed more to inflame desire than inspire religious contemplation. Alexander's primary mistress during his papal reign was Julia Farnese, a woman so beautiful that she was known throughout Rome as Julia la Bella. What made this relationship particularly scandalous wasn't just that the Pope was openly cohabiting with a woman young enough to be his daughter, but that he had conducted a ceremony that was essentially a marriage in everything but name. Julia lived in the papal apartments as the unofficial queen of the Vatican, presiding over social functions and wielding influence that rivaled that of any European empress. But Julia wasn't Alexander's only female companion. The Pope maintained what contemporary sources described as a stable of beautiful women, each assigned luxurious apartments within the Vatican complex. These weren't temporary liaisons or hidden affairs. They were permanent residents of the papal household, supported by church funds and treated with the respect normally accorded to nobility. The daily routine of Alexander's Vatican bore no resemblance to the austere spiritual life expected of the Catholic Church's supreme leader. Mornings that should have been devoted to prayer and meditation were instead spent in intimate activities with various mistresses. Afternoons featured elaborate banquets where the Pope and his female companions dined on delicacies while being entertained by musicians, dancers, and performers whose acts grew increasingly risque as the wine flowed. But the true horror of Alexander's papacy wasn't just his personal debauchery. It was how he systematically corrupted everyone around him, creating a culture of sexual license that infected the entire Vatican hierarchy. Cardinals who wanted to maintain the Pope's favor were expected to provide young and beautiful companions for papal entertainment. Bishops seeking advancement learned that their theological knowledge mattered less than their ability to procure attractive women for Vatican functions. The Pope's famous Banquet of Chestnuts in October 1501 represents the absolute nadir of papal corruption. Contemporary accounts describe an evening where 50 courtesans were invited to the papal apartments for what was ostensibly a harvest celebration. What actually occurred was an elaborate competition where naked women crawled around the floor collecting chestnuts while the Pope and his guests wagered on their performance. The evening concluded with various intimate activities conducted in full view of the papal court, with Alexander himself serving as both participant and judge. This wasn't a private party that got out of hand. It was a carefully planned event designed to demonstrate the Pope's complete rejection of Christian morality. Invitations were sent to foreign dignitaries and church officials, making the debauchery a matter of official papal policy rather than personal weakness. The message was clear. Under Alexander VI, the Vatican would celebrate physical pleasure rather than spiritual discipline. The psychological impact on Vatican staff was devastating. Priests and church officials who had devoted their lives to serving God found themselves complicit in activities that violated every principle they held sacred. Some fled Rome entirely, abandoning their positions rather than participate in the systematic corruption of their faith. Others adapted, learning to compartmentalize their beliefs and treat their work as a secular job rather than a religious calling. The most tragic victims were the young women drawn into Alexander's web of corruption. Many came from poor families who saw association with the papal court as an opportunity for advancement. They arrived as innocents, seeking patronage and protection, only to discover that their beauty and youth made them commodities to be traded among the Vatican's power brokers. The corruption of Alexander VI Vatican wasn't an isolated phenomenon, but the culmination of systemic problems that had been festering within the Catholic Church for generations. To understand how the papacy could fall so completely into moral bankruptcy, we must examine the institutional structures that enabled and even encouraged such behavior. The root of the problem lay in the Church's transformation from a spiritual institution into a temporal power wielding enormous political and economic influence. By the late 15th century, the Pope wasn't just the leader of Catholic Christians worldwide. He was also the ruler of the Papal States, commander of armies, and head of one of Europe's most sophisticated diplomatic networks. This concentration of power attracted men whose motivations were more political than spiritual. The process of papal election itself had become utterly corrupted, transformed into an auction where the papal crown went to the highest bidder. Alexander VI's own election in 1492 involved bribery so extensive and blatant that it shocked even Renaissance standards of corruption. Contemporary sources document how Rodrigo Borgia systematically purchased the votes of cardinals through a combination of cash payments, political promises, and offers of lucrative church positions for their relatives. This system of simony, the buying and selling of religious offices, created a church hierarchy with no genuine commitment to Christian values. Cardinals who had purchased their positions naturally sought to recoup their investments through similar corruption, creating a pyramid scheme of moral decay that extended throughout the church structure. By Alexander's time, virtually every significant position within the Catholic Church was for sale. The international political situation further enabled papal corruption by creating a market for church influence among competing European powers. France, Spain, and the various Italian city-states all sought papal support for their political objectives, and they were willing to pay enormous sums for it. Alexander VI perfected the art of playing these powers against each other, selling papal backing to multiple sides simultaneously while enriching himself and his family through the proceeds. Perhaps most insidiously, the papal court's corruption was enabled by a culture of willful blindness among those who might have opposed it. European monarchs who should have been scandalized by Alexander's behavior instead found his amorality useful for their own purposes. A pope who openly violated his vows was in no position to criticize the moral failings of secular rulers, creating a mutually beneficial relationship based on shared hypocrisy. The Vatican's financial structure also contributed to the systematic corruption. The enormous expenses of maintaining papal splendor required constant fundraising through increasingly creative means. The sale of indulgences, church offices, and even dispensations for forbidden activities became routine sources of revenue. Under Alexander, the Vatican essentially operated as a business where spiritual services were commodities to be sold to the highest bidder. Most tragically, the Church's own theology provided justification for papal excess through the doctrine of papal infallibility. If the Pope was God's representative on earth, then his actions must be divinely sanctioned regardless of how they appeared to mere mortals. This theological cover allowed Alexander and his supporters to frame even the most egregious corruption as mysterious divine will that ordinary humans couldn't be expected to understand. Let me tell you about 3 individuals whose lives were forever changed by Alexander VI's reign of corruption, each representing a different aspect of how papal depravity destroyed innocent lives and corrupted the very foundations of the Catholic Church. The first is Julia Farnese, who entered Alexander's life when she was barely 18 years old, a stunning young woman from an ambitious Roman family. Julia had been married off to Orsino Orsini, but her husband proved to be little more than a convenient fiction. Within months of the marriage, it became clear that Julia's real purpose was to serve as Alexander's primary mistress, with her husband's consent and even encouragement. Julia's transformation from innocent bride to papal concubine reveals the systematic way Alexander corrupted everyone around him. Initially horrified by the Pope's advances, she was gradually worn down through a combination of threats against her family and promises of advancement for her relatives. Her brother Alessandro was made a cardinal at the unprecedented age of 25, clearly as payment for Julia's services. But the price of this advancement was Julia's complete surrender of personal autonomy. She lived in gilded captivity within the Vatican, unable to leave without papal permission, monitored constantly by Alexander's agents, and forced to participate in increasingly degrading activities designed to demonstrate the Pope's power over her. Contemporary accounts describe how Alexander would display Julia like a prized possession during diplomatic receptions, making crude comments about her beauty and intimate performance in front of foreign ambassadors. The psychological toll on Julia was enormous. Letters discovered in Vatican archives centuries later reveal a woman struggling to maintain her sanity while trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. She wrote of feeling like a beautiful bird in a golden cage, loved for her appearance but valued only for her ability to satisfy papal desires. Her attempts to find spiritual comfort through prayer were mocked by Alexander, who delighted in forcing her to participate in blasphemous parodies of religious ceremonies. The second victim was Cardinal Giovanni Borgia, Alexander's own son, whose story illustrates how the Pope's corruption extended even to his treatment of his children. Giovanni had been groomed from childhood to advance the Borgia family's interests, but his father's expectations went far beyond normal dynastic ambitions. Alexander demanded that Giovanni serve not just as a military commander and political operative, but also as a procurer of young women for papal entertainment. Giovanni's conscience gradually rebelled against these demands, particularly after he witnessed the systematic abuse of innocent women who had been lured to the Vatican under false pretenses. When he began showing reluctance to participate in his father's schemes, Alexander responded with characteristic brutality. The Pope stripped Giovanni of his military commands, threatened his personal safety, and ultimately arranged for his mysterious death in 1497. The official story claimed Giovanni had been murdered by unknown assassins, but contemporary sources strongly suggest that Alexander himself ordered his son's elimination when Giovanni became a liability to papal operations. The most tragic figure in this sordid tale is Lucrezia Borgia herself, Alexander's daughter, whose name has become synonymous with Renaissance corruption, but who was, in reality, one of the Pope's most exploited victims. Lucrezia was used as a political pawn from earliest childhood, married, and divorced multiple times as papal alliances shifted. But her father's abuse went far beyond merely arranging advantageous marriages. Contemporary sources, carefully hidden in Vatican archives for centuries, document Alexander's inappropriate relationship with his own daughter. Lucrezia was forced to live in the papal apartments, participate in her father's depraved entertainments, and submit to intimate examinations by papal physicians who reported details of her physical condition directly to Alexander. The Pope's obsession with his daughter's personal life was so notorious that it became the subject of diplomatic correspondence throughout Europe. When Lucrezia finally escaped through marriage to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, she carried with her psychological scars that never fully healed. Letters from her later life reveal a woman haunted by nightmares, unable to form normal relationships, and consumed by shame over experiences that were entirely beyond her control. She died young, possibly by suicide, though the official cause was listed as complications from childbirth. When Alexander VI finally died in August 1503, possibly from poison intended for one of his enemies, the immediate reaction throughout Christian Europe was not mourning but relief. Church bells rang in celebration across Protestant regions, where Alexander's papacy had provided endless ammunition for critics of Catholic corruption. Even in Catholic territories, many viewed his death as divine intervention to save the Church from complete moral collapse. The immediate aftermath revealed the full extent of damage Alexander had inflicted on the papal institution. The Vatican treasury was virtually empty, drained by years of lavish spending on personal pleasures and family advancement. The Papal States were in revolt, with local populations outraged by the taxation needed to fund papal debauchery. Most seriously, the moral authority of the Catholic Church had been so thoroughly undermined that it would take generations to recover even minimal credibility. The Protestant Reformation, which erupted just 14 years after Alexander's death, drew much of its popular support from revulsion at the corruption he represented. Martin Luther's criticisms of papal corruption resonated so powerfully precisely because Alexander VI had demonstrated that such criticisms were entirely justified. The Borgia papacy became Exhibit A in Protestant arguments that the Catholic Church had abandoned Christian principles entirely. Yet the Church's response to this crisis reveals the institutional forces that had enabled Alexander's rise in the first place. Rather than acknowledging the systematic corruption that had made his reign possible, Church officials began an elaborate cover-up designed to minimize the scandal. Official papal histories downplayed or omitted entirely the most disturbing aspects of Alexander's behavior. Documents were sealed in secret archives where they remained hidden for centuries. This historical whitewashing has persisted into modern times. Catholic encyclopedias still describe Alexander VI in relatively mild terms, focusing on his political achievements while glossing over the intimate corruption that defined his papacy. The Vatican's secret archives contain thousands of documents related to the Borgia papacy that remain classified, suggesting that the full extent of Alexander's depravity may still be unknown. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. Restoration work on the papal apartments has uncovered frescoes and architectural details that confirm the most lurid accounts of Alexander's reign. Hidden chambers designed for intimate encounters, secret passages for discreet movement of mistresses, and elaborate bathhouses equipped for group activities all testify to the systematic transformation of the Vatican into a pleasure palace. Perhaps most tragically, Alexander's legacy extends beyond historical curiosity to ongoing issues within the Catholic Church. The institutional structures that enabled his corruption remain largely unchanged, creating ongoing vulnerabilities to similar abuse of power. The corruption of Alexander VI isn't merely a historical curiosity. It represents a pattern of institutional abuse that continues to manifest in different forms throughout modern society. Understanding how the most powerful religious institution in the world could be transformed into a personal pleasure palace provides crucial insights into the dangers that continue to threaten contemporary institutions. The core mechanism that enabled Alexander's reign of depravity was the concentration of absolute power in the hands of a single individual, combined with institutional structures that discouraged criticism and punished dissent. This same combination appears repeatedly in modern scandals involving religious leaders, political figures, and corporate executives who use their positions to exploit those under their authority. Alexander's use of family members as instruments of power finds echoes in modern nepotism scandals, where leaders install relatives in key positions to ensure loyalty and silence. The systematic corruption of the papal court, where advancement required complicity in immoral activities, mirrors contemporary situations where institutional culture normalizes unethical behavior through peer pressure and career incentives. Perhaps most disturbingly, Alexander's ability to maintain public support despite obvious corruption demonstrates how charismatic leaders can manipulate public opinion through careful propaganda and the strategic use of benefits for supporters. His lavish spending on public entertainments and architectural projects created a constituency that overlooked his personal failings in exchange for material benefits. The international community's willingness to work with Alexander despite knowledge of his corruption, reflects ongoing patterns where geopolitical interests override moral considerations. Just as Renaissance monarchs found the Borgia Pope useful for their political objectives, modern governments often maintain relationships with corrupt leaders when it serves their strategic interests. Most importantly, Alexander's story demonstrates how quickly institutional norms can collapse when leadership abandons ethical constraints. The transformation of the Vatican from spiritual center to pleasure palace occurred within months, showing how rapidly corruption can spread through even the most established institutions when proper safeguards are removed. Return with me now to that young cardinal walking through the Vatican corridors, witnessing the destruction of everything he held sacred. In that moment of horrified revelation, he represents more than just one man's crisis of faith. He embodies the shattering of an institution's moral foundation and the human cost of unchecked power. Alexander VI's reign as the most perverted pope in history wasn't just about one man's intimate appetites. It was about the systematic corruption of an institution that millions trusted for spiritual guidance. The women who suffered in his private chambers, the children used as political pawns, and the faithful whose trust was betrayed, all paid the price for a system that valued power over principle. The Pope, who should have been the guardian of Christian morality, instead became its greatest destroyer. The man who claimed to represent God on earth transformed the Vatican into a brothel while maintaining the facade of holy leadership. His legacy serves as a permanent reminder that no institution, regardless of its claimed divine authority, is immune to corruption when proper safeguards are abandoned. The marble corridors that once echoed with the sounds of Alexander's depraved entertainments still stand today, now silent but not forgiven. The frescoes celebrating physical pleasure over spiritual devotion remain hidden beneath layers of later papal renovations, but they cannot be entirely erased from history. Alexander VI achieved a kind of immortality, but not the sacred legacy he sought. His name survives as a warning about the dangers of absolute power and the human capacity for evil when moral constraints are removed. In the end, the most perverted pope in history left behind not a strengthened church, but a shattered institution that would spend centuries trying to recover from the horrors of his reign. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.